Good afternoon and welcome to our penultimate work session on the fiscal year 2022 budget. This is a conversation with the board, the manager, where we will have a number of questions that we'll ask as we seek to move towards finalizing our fiscal year 2022 budget. The whole board is assembled and we will get to questions, but there's just a short introductory comment or two from our manager, and then I'll set forward some topics. Just before I do send it to you, Mr. Manager, the topics that I propose to go through are areas where we've talked about guidance. So there are about 5 or 6, and then we will, of course, have time for as many questions as board members have. The first would be the American Rescue Plan allocations for that contingency that is proposed at 17.5 million in the budget. We certainly also employee compensation is a second topic. I know there's interest in discussing as well a couple of areas for guidance, perhaps housing grants and maybe AHIF as a third topic. Arts grants, restorative justice. Those are a few topics that I know we'll have. There's also questions that our Community Services Board has about developmental disabilities. We'll have other big topics, but I wanted to give you a few so we could try and organize some of our discussion. And with that, I'll send it to the manager for any other introductory remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the board. So one of our goals today is to surface any remaining questions that you have so that we would be able to come back to you with answers that we could share with you. I know that I have laid out a timeline that would hopefully have us meeting again on Thursday to actually put together what is called the chairman's mark, which would be an allocation of dollars. Some of those dollars that have been added to our consideration were noted in a memo that I sent to the board summarizing third quarter results. And that memo is on the Department of Management and Finance website. And that goes through a summary of what happened in the third quarter analysis this fiscal year and a reanalysis of the assumptions we made when we proposed the budget. So back to you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you for pointing us to that memo. So I'll start us off, but go with hands whenever you're ready with questions. But I just on the COVID-19 contingent, this is in the county manager's message and slated for proposed for 17.5 million. We've gotten a number of comments about emergency rental assistance, which the manager proposes for approximately 5 million. Then there's our vaccine program, which we'll talk about in our work session at 6 as far as substance, is slated for 2 million. I think some of this, it's a contingent because we don't know exactly whether the testing and tracing funding will be, how that will fall between testing and tracing and the vaccines and some of the other COVID needs. Also identified is community business support, suggested at 2 million, and PPE and cleaning and safety for 3 million. So any big questions? I know that there's been some discussion of guidance to the manager on that. Any big questions in this area? It's a lot of money, but it's broadly fits with our past priorities. I didn't mention hunger, but I know that's one that we all share. But anything on that item? And you don't have to make, I mean, if you have questions, go for it. If you don't have to make them up. If not, talk us, Mr. Karantonis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Manager, for working long and very diligently on the budget this year after a very challenging year. and many budgets, many 2020 budgets, right? Calendar 2020 budgets. So I wanted to ask one thing that helps me understand a little bit how we provide rent and eviction prevention assistance and how this balances with the housing grants program. So what is, I understand that the housing grants program is ongoing funding, eviction prevention and COVID-related rent support are one-time funds. So how are these two balanced, and what is your proposal there? How should we balance these?
Okay, and I neglected to mention that I have a lot of staff with me today. So as I refer to them, I'm going to ask Michelle Cowan to answer your question on this particular item. So Michelle.
Ms. Cowan. Well,
you're muted.
Yeah, Michelle, you're muted. Okay. Well, while we're waiting for Michelle,
should we go to?
No, that's all right. Let me lay out the outlines of the answer. It's just Michelle will have all the details. The eviction prevention funding that was included in the 2021 budget was used essentially to provide funding to Thrive as an organization to make sure that it would go to individuals who are affected by the potential of losing their residences. We also, the state has, and I'm going to lose the initials of the program, maybe someone else can help me here. The state has a program where now they're working directly with landlords. So they have stepped in and provided direct financial assistance. Michelle, you want to pick it up from here?
No, I'm sorry, I was dealing with an emergency issue that came up. Yeah, the state has been handling the RMRP program directly with landlords. And what we've heard to date is that it's actually been going very well, meaning like AHC and APA have been really able to work directly with their clients to get them into that system. So everything I've heard is that it's been a positive thing, and certainly our key stakeholders, it's been working well.
Yeah. So Michelle, I don't know if you caught the first part of that question, which was, how does that link up with the assistance we've been providing to Thrive, for example, on eviction prevention and the need for setting aside contingent funds?
Well, I think that, with the money that the freed up 17.5, that the plan would still be that any gaps as DHS is evaluating the data and seeing the data from both Thrive and then hearing from our nonprofit partners, that we would allocate a part of that to continue to meet the demand. It's varied month by month, but I think we're feeling like if the amount of that allocation can stay to be flexible to deal with it, then we should be, if you will, okay, but no plan to retrench on the overall assistance, whether it comes from the state's RMRP program or from Thrive, that we'd be in a position to, meet the demand.
Great, thanks. Mr. Karantonis, you also mentioned housing grants. My impression is that the contingent would be Thrive focused, but we will come back to housing grants because I know several of us have quite an interest in that, and I want to give colleagues as much time to ask questions on this one as well. Ms. Crystal.
That actually was my same line of questioning, was the relationship between what it would take to make permanent some of the alternative guidelines we've come up with for housing grants, and whether that wouldn't be an eligible use for federal relief, particularly knowing that federal relief is likely to bridge 2 years. So there might not be that kind of cliff for our housing grants assistance recipients. I'm happy to hold that until we get to the housing grants conversation.
Well, we got 2 questions on it, and Libby, Ms. Garvey also nodded. So unless there's other questions on the contingent, the 17.5 million, let's go to housing grants because there is a couple of different ways of working those housing grants, and we're mindful of funding. So I think Mr. Schwartz.
Yeah, as far as it's my understanding, and I will welcome being corrected on this, but that a majority of the board is interested in making sure that the changes in the eligibility criteria for housing grants, which, for example, if we hadn't changed the criteria, the fact that people were getting unemployment compensation would have counted against their eligibility for getting housing grants. Making those kinds of changes, and I'm sure Michelle will know them off the top of her head, is something that's recommended to carry forward, and we support doing that. The other part of that is that the housing grants, to the extent that the board wants to continue that or increase the allocation of that, we can work those criteria into it. And Michelle, do you want to add anything to that?
No, other than we just sent out it should be coming to you shortly, a work session response that lays out the details on the eligibility criteria that were lifted at the beginning of the pandemic regarding how certain income, and it particularly helped working families who, of course, had faced employment issues for their, for their household, because it's a household basis. So how we treated unemployment compensation, all those things, all meaning to be helpful for those working families. So I think when you see that, you'll see that it's around $1 million in quote ongoing costs each year. I know we've talked a little bit to Mr. Dorsey about this. It was meant to be pandemic related. So depending on how we see the tail of the pandemic, does that need to be in place for 1 year or 2 years? I think we would just kind of revisit again during next year's budget. But for now, assume that it's ongoing. We also had done some put together the cost proposal for another idea that has surfaced over the years and we began to address 2 years ago, which is, as you know, families do have to contribute a little bit of their annual income towards their rent, and we were at 40%. And so what the cost would be of getting that down to 30%, which is around $500,000, give or take. So I think those two changes certainly would have a near-term, big near-term impact on that program and help with that. All of the things that go together with helping people keep their housing, or given eviction prevention, that assistance, keeping them from losing their housing. We're trying to kind of keep both of that, if you will, together, if that makes sense.
It does. And if I could just follow up on the question, Mr. Chair, thank you so much, both for this excellent summary and then for the analysis you provided us. I find it really useful that you've provided us 2 different estimates of what it would cost to reduce the client's income contribution down to 30%, which, as you shared, is a little shy of $500,000, separated from keeping these alternative guidelines. Because I think my understanding is the former, dropping the income contribution, really is sort of a policy change for this program on an ongoing basis, and one that I'm interested to pursue and seems to me really needs to come out of ongoing funding. The question about the alternative COVID guidelines, I'm really trying, we're now at this point in our budget, right, where the color of money really starts to matter, whether it's ongoing or one time. And so I believe that management and finance had recommended to us that it's about, I think, $1.03 million needed to make permanent or demi-permanent or semi-permanent the COVID guidelines. So I think to put an even finer point on that question, knowing that the federal money is going to span over 2 years, would this be, in your estimation, a responsible use of that money while we figure out, whether these are the right guidelines to keep permanently and how we might pay for them on an ongoing basis starting in fiscal 24? Or if we want to make that change, would you really urge us to find an ongoing source for that starting now in fiscal 2022?
Let me take a crack at that. I think that what you have to do is you have to weigh the importance of making the change, which I understand to be quite important, against the source of the money. And remember, the federal dollars here under the American Rescue Plan, though they're coming to us in 2 tranches, they each of those dollars has a 4-year timeline on it. So even though you have 2 separate buckets, theoretically, if you parceled the money out, you could have it available for 5 years. I'm not recommending that, but I think that gets into I like that demi-permanent category where the money could be set aside for that. But realize if you were to take, for example, $600,000 and set it towards that, but expect that money to last for 4 years, what you've done is you've used between $2 and $3 million of that bucket. So over the 3 to 4 year period, but that would allow you enough time to work in permanent ongoing dollars, which is what when I became manager 4 years ago, I've worked really hard to get our housing grant funds to be ongoing dollars. And I feel pretty strongly about that. But here, I think there's a way to do it with some of the federal money.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I know, I think Ms. Garvey is next. Mr. Dorsey has also been working on language, I think, related to this. So we'll go to Ms. Garvey and then we'll get to you, Christian.
I'll be just quick because I think Mr. Dorsey has been doing some work. This is really helpful, and I'm very supportive of looking at both of these and moving them forward. If we had 5 years to kind of figure out what to do, that seems like a good thing. My question is, I haven't seen, and I've maybe just missed it. How many families, how many households does this affect? You know, we're talking about this in this program. I assume we know how many households we've been kind of keeping in their homes. Are you able to tell us, and that's not crucial to my decision on this, but I thought it might be helpful to know.
I mean, I can say that we know the analysis that DHS has done an excellent job at this for the relaxed COVID sort of eligibility restrictions. It's helped over like 107 working families, and then slightly lower amount of seniors and disabled households, around 10. So that gives you a sense of that. And I can pull out, if you give me a minute, we can look at least data from a little while ago about how many households are served overall on the program, just to give you a sense of that perspective. But it is broken down between roughly a third, as I recall, between working families, disabled, and seniors.
Thank you.
Just what that incremental change is. And then in the response that we sent, it would help for the AMI issue, the 40 to 30, I believe it was around 700 families, but I'll check on that.
Wow. It's helpful to know how many. Thank you. And that was what a little bit of pencil work on the finance here more, and I appreciate hearing from him now. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Ms. Garvey. Mr. Dorsey.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, the housing grants conversation is multifaceted. So we've just, talked about structural ways to think about the program to deliver better utility to the people who are enrolled, of which I all support. But there's also the need that's been articulated by many advocates that the program is not including all whom could benefit from it, and we would likely desire to help by it. So on that dimension, I've been exploring, with staff's help, and we're still kind of percolating the data, but how we can maybe think about this program to not necessarily be tied as it is policy-wide towards CAF rents, so committed affordable unit rents. You'll note that change was made a year or so ago, where maximum allowable rents were designed to reflect the rental rates charged at CAF units. And, we know that somewhere around 94% of all housing grant recipients live in CAFs. However, there is the consideration policy-wise as to whether or not we would like to provide opportunities for people to live outside of CAF units, which would have the ancillary effect of freeing up other CAF units for non-housing grant recipients. Chief impediment toward achieving that are that market rents are a little bit higher than what CAF rents are. And so if we had a different policy standard, such as median rental rates, what would that do in terms of allowing more of our lower income community whose housing burden to benefit? So that's where we're exploring. Still not quite there in terms of figuring out what the exact recommendation or ask or consideration might be, but coming very soon.
Great, thank you, Mr. Dorsey. I mean, I think we've heard from each colleague some support in their three different areas for moving forward. Mr. Manager.
Yeah, one thing I did want to emphasize, because I know Mr. Dorsey, we have talked about this, but expanding the scope of the program to cover different people who aren't currently covered would get us into, I'll call, the gray area about how we use the federal money. And so that is something that I think until we get some more guidance from the Treasury Department, and we need the time to get that, could make that solely a county taxpayer obligation. And that's neither good nor bad. It's just counsels on how we approach it.
Got it. I think Mr. Karantonis and then Ms. Garvey.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a note, there are three major groups that benefit from housing grants based on the basic eligibility. This is senior citizens on fixed income, low income. This is one group that I don't believe will change a lot because of COVID and the economic downturn and the pressures right now. It will, but not a lot. The second is citizens with disabilities, residents with disabilities, I should say. This is also a group that I believe the variability of this group is relatively low. The third group, like families with one child or more, this is a group that is very affected right now. It will also vary, and this is where I believe that Mr. Swartz is right, that we will see eligibility and also under federal funding, maybe this year or over the next 4 years. So that makes it even more interesting to discuss. Thank you.
Sure, Mr. Dorsey. Oh, okay. So my thinking on this is, I mean, demi-permanent is a new word, like vestigial hand. We have, we have the adjustments to eligibility, and then we have the 40% to 30%. For my part, I think Mr. Dorsey, and Mr. Schwartz makes a good point on the total cost. I'm interested in trying to make progress on that gap between where we are and median. And in some conversations, I think, Mr. Dorsey, you may have thoughts about starting to make a commitment, which, a quarter or a third or something as we work towards this in the midst of this. I'm supportive of that. I'm mindful of the need to be fiscally responsible. I also, happen to have the housing grants October snapshot, and we're talking about working families under 28,000, folks with disabilities under 14,900, and 65 and older income at 15,500. So that's just an indication. I know most of you know this. Mr. Dorsey.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. That's excellent. I just wanted to maybe, because we've kind of gone with the assumption of seeking demi-permanence, what precisely from this year was that focused on? Were there all of the changes or the substitution of unemployment compensation for earned income? I just was unclear as to what the proposal was. All of it or just pieces of it?
Well, for me, it depends a lot on the other components. For me, I'm open to all of it, but not all the way on the median component being demi-permanent, because my impression is the demi-permanent is a cost score that's pretty significant. Does that answer your question?
No, I think I got it. If it's all of the pandemic-related changes that we made last year, while I certainly support and agree that they ought to be carried forward in their entirety for FY22, I don't think necessarily all of them should carry forward beyond that. So there are elements of those that I think could and should, but not all. So I just wanted to make sure we were being specific about what we intended to carry forward beyond next year.
Great. I see a thumbs up and then a question. Thanks, Ms. Garvey and Ms. Crystal.
Well, I just wanted to respond to that because I agree, and that new term is like carrying a lot of work with what is meant by demi. So here's my thinking. We just got, literally since we started this work session, some follow-up from staff, and I know this will be posted publicly, so the many members of our community who are interested in the housing grants program can follow along. But there are some specifics about the changes, unemployment compensation substituted for earned income, the minimum work hour requirements. A lot of these definitely payroll protection are specifically pandemic related. Here's what I want to make sure we don't do is create a cliff, right? I think there is definitely the worry that some of these pandemic relief features will go away all at the same time before the sectors of the economy in which our housing grants recipients disproportionately work fully come back. So my thinking when I say demi-permanent is, let's not set ourselves up by making this purely one time in fiscal 22, because I can imagine a universe in which, there's a stat that I keep here circulating, for example, that it took unemployment numbers among Black women to come back to mid-aughts recession levels. It took them until 2018. And so that is like a stat that's really weighing heavily on my mind. So whether it's these criteria or others that we need to keep flexible, because that recovery is going to be so slow for some community members potentially. So that's what I'm thinking. Like there may be some that we want even at the end of 2 years to make more permanent. And then, as the manager said, we really need to start talking about general fund tax support. But that's what demi-permanent means to me anyway.
Sure.
No, that's very helpful. And I fully agree and associate myself with that. And I think as you assess conditions, there's also a way you treat people who are already enrolled in the program versus people who are newly applying to the program. And I think there's not that level of bifurcation. This would just carry this through next year. If we're thinking about more permanence, we might want to think about considering them differently. So this is just to surface that there are a lot of considerations beyond the buckets of money and what the present day cost estimate would be.
Very helpful, and really shows the fiscal, even fiscally, we want to be smart, even as we're trying to help those most in need through this important program. So moving on from housing grants, I do think it's all of us. This was a priority without almost immediately. So the other areas for discussion, one that I'll just float up there is employee compensation. And if we don't have extensive discussion that's on this subject, that's not a crisis, but I know it is a priority of each of ours. So there's discussion in the proposed budget of one-time funding for a bonus. And there's I know that the managers shared thoughts about potentially a second bonus or an increase in that bonus. And there's also our stated desire to see if we can do ongoing funding. I guess, Mr. Manager, you might know more. It's likely that the Treasury Department regulations on the American Rescue Plan, which could be relevant in part, are in May at some point, but we don't know more than that. Is that right?
Yeah. So, Mr. Chair, I've been on many of the same phone calls that you have with Senator Warner, Senator Kane, Congressman Beyer, a whole host of elected officials in Northern Virginia, and also in the Council of Governments who've been, I'll use the professional term here, grinding away at the federal government to try to get guidance as to whether, on this specific question, whether the Rescue Act dollars would be available for foregone pay raises and what that means. We still don't have an answer. So in my third quarter memo that I sent to you, I recommended allocating funds for 1% merit pay across the board for all employees, in addition to the net $500 gross $850 bonus for employees. And that is where I stand with my recommendation. I think as information becomes clearer as to how we could use the Rescue Act dollars, I could be back to you with an additional recommendation. Now, there are other options also that you've asked about, which include what would be the cost of increasing that merit pay or bifurcating the merit pay for different groups of employees. And I'm happy to answer that if that's the will of the board.
Thank you, Mr. Schwartz. Ms. Garvey.
Thank you. Mr. Schwartz, I'll take you up on your offer to ask questions. I am very interested in another 1% for our public safety employees. So they would be getting a 2%. And part of that is based on my memory, which could be incorrect, that we some years ago embarked on an effort to bring up our public safety employees, their pay level, to make it a little more commensurate with the region and the kind of competitive state that we're in there. Is that memory correct? Because if that's the case, adding the 1% here feels to me it's not really related exactly to COVID. It's actually getting us back to where, and not even all the way there, on a path that I believe we decided to embark upon some years ago. Am I remembering that correctly?
You are, and for a period of, I think it was 2 years, it was interrupted last year. We had I've made differential pay proposals that the board has adopted for across the board increases of about 5 to 5.5% for public safety pay, whereas general employees were receiving somewhere between 3 and 3.5%. That was meant to address two items. One is the problem at entry pay, given that our public safety staff are almost universally hired at entry, unlike our general employees. So increasing that entry pay was really an important competitive step to take. The other one was an analysis that showed how our public safety workforce, in comparison to our neighbors, was taking longer for them to get to the top of the scale. And we, when I say we, at the time it was the board and myself had committed to trying to get there in a 10-year period for a new hire. So this slows us down. To give you an order of magnitude, if you were to have an equivalent 1% pay raise for the general workforce, that comes to about 2.4 million. A 1% raise just for public safety is about a quarter of that, $800,000. That is the simple answer. The complicated answer is for every percent pay raise that you give to a workforce that is that hires at entry, unless you make some adjustments, what happens is the pay tends to compress. And so there are other issues there. That's really not worth getting into for purposes of this. But as a rule of thumb, it's 1 out of $4 that we spend on pay raises go to public safety.
That's very helpful. Thank you. And so I'm concluding from this too, that had it not been for the pandemic, we would have continued with those, that differential moving forward. You would have proposed that again, 5.5% for public safety with 3.5% for our general employees, most likely. Is that?
Yeah, but before we took you up on your commitment to resiliency, you remember we proposed a budget in February of last year that had exactly that in it. The second budget that we proposed last year did not have that in it. So there is the model that was laid out there. We had committed to carrying through on that. At least I had proposed that. I don't know where the board would have ended up.
Yeah, thank you. That's very helpful. So colleagues, I am very interested on the extra 1% for public safety, sort of for all the reasons that we just covered, to get us a little bit back on the path we were on. And then I'm very interested in perhaps once we have better information about the American Rescue Act and what it can be used on, making some other considerations. But that's kind of where I am now. So the 1% for general employees, it would be 2% for public safety, and then the 800 bonus that comes out to, I guess you said, effectively 500 per person. So that's kind of where I am now, and I'm happy to hear other arguments and discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Garvey. Mr. Karantonis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just for clarification, Ms. Garvey, are you supporting 1% across the board, $850 gross bonus across the board, plus 1% for public safety employees, right? How is this? I mean, given that, at least in my opinion, and I believe that is, widely shared, this opinion, that the entire workforce has worked absolutely, above and beyond this entire year, and still doing that work. And I understand the other justifications for the 1% for public safety. What I'm trying to figure out is why would that not be extended to the entire workforce and dispense with the bonus in this case? And I'm asking also the manager, what is the comparative cost? How much is 2% versus 1 plus 850 plus?
Yeah, but on the dollar amounts, by rule of thumb, 1% merit across the board is about 2.4 million, and the component just for public safety is about 800,000. That's a cost for merit-based pay. As to, I'm going to need help here, Emily or Richard, as to the amount that the bonus costs. What is that?
It's about 2.6 million.
Yeah, that's 2.6 million across the board as a net bonus of $500. Now, realizing, of course, these are different kinds of money. Bonus money is one-time money, and the merit pay is ongoing.
And Mr. Carantonis, if I can answer your question, which I think you sort of picked up. For me, absolutely all our employees deserve, it's been incredible what they've done and deserve more if we can do it. And my understanding is maybe with more information with the American Rescue Act, we might decide down the line we can, but this is what we're sort of comfortable with, or at least the staff are. But for me, pulling out the public safety, it is indeed because we had embarked on a path some years ago that I think was a valuable one and that we should continue. And this doesn't even get us there. It just helps keep us going. So it kind of, in a way, it's mitigating the damage that the pandemic has done on that effort, which I think is an important one. Does that help?
Yes, it helps you understand the proposal. Yes.
Great, thank you both. Mr. Dorsey.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Carantonis, for getting at the details there. I just say my initial response, Ms. Garvey, I appreciate the spirit of what you're trying to do, but if I'm going to go with your rationale, I can't get there on the number because effectively yours would be doubling, whereas the sort of catch-up model before was somewhere in the 60% range. And I realize that we're talking about small numbers here, but I think that makes it all the more important because in many ways, people are going to perceive this as valuing some employees twice as much as others. And I think, given Mr. Carantonis's point about the, work of the public health directors and other sectors of employees who've really gone above and beyond and done things beyond their job descriptions and that a year and a half ago, we never would have expected them to do. That's difficult for me to get there on that. I would love more compensation across the board without consequences of, creating any sort of disparate levels of valuing employees, because in this particular year, I don't feel that, and I don't want to show that with our compensation package, but I completely understand where you're trying to go with it. The other thing I just wanted to mention on this, and I'm losing it in the morass of my chicken scratch writing.
Can I respond to what you just said, if I can? And then I'll let you find your notes. And I really appreciate that. If we end up just, giving everyone a higher percentage increase and we can do it, that's great. And I wasn't thinking of it as doubling there with, I was actually continuing to think the goal was getting them to another point, which is the region. So that's where I was looking, catching up to the region, not comparing it to other employees, but comparing it to the region. So that's how I came up with that and not feeling as uncomfortable with it. But I appreciate your argument. Thank you.
Yeah, and I would just say that for me, at least personally, this year is all about budget-wise doing the best we can to make sure our employees' living standards are not eroded. This is not the year where we're kind of dealing with catching up people to market comparators. I know we've done compensation analysis. There are other job classes that we haven't even talked about during this discussion that have fallen behind market that we're not going to address. So whatever we do, I think for me personally, I would use this year as trying to improve everyone's living standards as much as we can, and maybe save those differentials for a better budget year. But that's just me.
Thank you, Mr. Dorsey. Ms. Crystal.
Just to weigh on the topic at hand and maybe a broader one, to borrow a term that I learned from our manager that I just love, I'm going to be the skunk at the garden party. And just remind us that one of the ways in which our job is perhaps considerably less fun than members of Congress is that we have to deliver a balanced budget. And so the amount of money in in ongoing funds is additional. I think we're grateful to realize a little bit of it. I know we talked just last night with our school board colleagues that they're grateful to realize a little bit from the B poll and others. I think when we get down to actually tinkering with the budget spreadsheet, which I've been trying to do myself, we'll find that there's very little of it. And so I'm would be very happy to entertain that kind of idea if I can see the pay for. I mean, I think even trying to just raise the housing grants to the levels that we just talked about. In terms of the lowering from 40% to 30% of income is going to swamp what's available, along with some of the add backs, like our nonprofits that have been proposed for cuts that we really do want to restore in an ongoing way. So I appreciate the spirit of it. I think our public safety staff and other frontline staff have had a year that in an ideal world would be compensated, beyond normal increases, let alone less than normal increases. But we do need to balance this budget. As I've said before, I'm very uncomfortable paying for certainly something as definitionally ongoing as salaries with one-time money, and there is very little of the ongoing money available. So I'd bring that up just on this point or any others. The question is just where the money comes from.
Thank you, Ms. Crystal. I think we've surfaced the issues and the questions. I will say that in addition to the manager's memo, there's an increase in the one-time bonus proposal that I think might be consistent with what everyone has shared. That does not address the question, the dialogue we just had with each of us articulating important considerations. And so I think, I would be inclined to leave the compensation discussion there as we seek to finalize, because I do think the details are going to be very important. I guess I would just sort of pause there, and there are other big picture topics that are out there. One of the goals that Mr. Manager, you articulated was make sure we get all the questions out there. And so I'm going to sort of pause on big picture topics and see if we can leave it to you colleagues to sort of do a round robin of trying to articulate questions that you don't think have surfaced just yet. And I will, let's see, I will hold off. I mean, I have one that I could mention that hasn't been discussed in some time. But I'll start with Ms. Crystal, and then I'll fill in as we go around.
I actually think Ms. Garvey beat me to it, so I'll give her the floor for the first questions.
Ms. Garvey.
It's a quick one that I think I should know the answer to, but there's been a lot flying around. It's Mr. Manager, it's on the WMATA subsidy contingency. Would that be one-time money? I'm assuming maybe it is, but I'm not sure. So if you could help with that would be helpful.
Yeah, our intention would be that if you set aside a contingent, it would be out of the one-time money. Okay. I'm not gonna lie to you and say that I have a clue as to what is going to happen with Metro past fiscal 22. I mean, there's been talk of reducing fares, and it's a much longer conversation. So yeah, it is one-time money.
Thank you. That's helpful. Yeah, and I don't, who knows whether the federal government will start to support transit more than they have in the past too. So thank you. That's helpful. That's it. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Ms. Garvey. Ms. Crystal, and then Mr. Dorsey.
Excellent. Thanks. Two questions on very different topics. The fleet conversion, the electrification of our fleet. So there is an option you all have highlighted for us of potentially setting aside a small amount of money, and this of course would be one time because it's procurement, right, for electric vehicle purchase. But I do think, well, one of the questions that was somewhat answered in a work session, and then there was sort of a little bit more of an answer in writing, was just the timing on when we could start to see commitment to especially sedans. When we could start to see a line in the sand that after that date we would only be purchasing electric vehicles consistent with, for example, what Fairfax has done. I know we had a recommendation from our C2E2 that I thought was really interesting, that henceforth any internal combustion engine vehicles should be at least accompanied by a memo explaining why an electric vehicle isn't feasible. So, I'm interested potentially in some direction. I just want to make sure I'm really understanding. I know there is a study underway. To date, when we've asked about it, that's kind of the answer we've been given. But just if I could get a slightly more specific answer on staff's thoughts about, if we were to say in this budget, either with some small dollars or just guidance, that henceforth we'd like to see all sedans purchased as electric vehicles, and maybe adopted the C2E2 recommendation about this policy that non-EVs have to be accompanied by a memo explaining why an EV isn't feasible. Just reactions to that. I'd like to put a finer point on this issue, I think is probably what you're getting from me. And I'd like staff's reaction to whether that's a bad idea. So I don't know if there's anything. I know we don't have anybody from DES, let alone the Automotive Bureau, here to respond to that. So maybe that's something I could get in writing.
So let me start off, and I'm going to look to see, isn't it very entertaining when you have a meeting to see which circle is going to light up? We'll see which one lights up, but I see Richard's is going to light up, but I did want to make the distinction. I don't think C2E2 spent a lot of time on this, but we have, when it comes to public safety vehicles, I don't want to minimize this. We're really, we don't want to permanently carve them out from the conversation because there is hope that the performance issues will be addressed. But for right now, we're not including them as part of this conversation, at least on my end. I'm going to let Richard provide some further background.
So, DES could obviously provide a more fulsome answer, but in our conversation with them, to your sedan question, the EV it's almost the default now, right? Moving forward. When we were talking about the traffic safety officers, they're going to employ the EV vehicles. I think what we need to remember is through 21 and even into 22, we went through a process with DES and with all the departments and deferred a significant amount of vehicles because of utilization. And so we're not actually purchasing the same volume of vehicles we would in a particular fiscal year because we've lengthened the life of the ones that we have. Right. Now that's separate and apart from where if we just want to swap out gasoline vehicles with EV, that's a different policy conversation. But as they become up for replacement, my impression with DES is that EV is the default first choice, and then we say, why can't you? So I will allow DES to follow up with a more fulsome answer. And in public safety, yeah, but the opening question is, well, why can't you have EV?
Okay, well, that's great. So I think there's probably a lot to go on here then to just kind of make that the high level expectation of this policymaking body, what is hopefully already the practice. And I can see it looks like Mr. Carantonis wanted to jump in.
Ms. Crystal, can I just a small follow-up question to that? Is the only way to replace our fleet, whatever the replacement pace will be, purchasing new vehicles, or is leasing as well a viable option for us?
For some of our heavy vehicles, we go through a lease.
For the sedans.
Oh, for the sedans, I would have to
because
let the Auto Equipment Bureau sort of opine on the funding and whether that makes more sense or not from outright purchase.
What I'm after is that these vehicles for now come very often with federal tax credits and other incentives that we as a government entity cannot realize, but a private entity can, and we could then split the difference. I mean, you understand what I mean. Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Carantonis. Ms. Crystal, Mr. Dorsey, I think there's a lot of agreement here. I haven't yet heard a reason why the bullets in that letter can't be met, at least from my perspective, but maybe there's tweaking. Mr. Dorsey.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. To that issue, it seems like this is done. So it's already being done. We're just looking for a standard reporting mechanism to show the work, basically. So I don't think we need to spend much more time on it than that. I will say there has been other conversation, though, about increasing the number of vehicles that we budget for in the next year, or at least that's how I've interpreted. I've just wanted to put out a position that I'm not interested in putting more money to purchase more vehicles than staff has proposed to purchase in the upcoming year, but I may have misread a particular proposal wrong.
I think what you heard Mr. Stevenson say is that we have postponed vehicle purchases. That has not answered your question, which is that do we need to purchase all those vehicles? We haven't I have a come to Uber meeting, which is different than a come to Jesus meeting when it comes to our auto fleet. There's a lot more conversations that need to happen.
Okay.
Great.
Thanks.
So,
And actually, Mr. Chair, my actual question was about just the compensation piece that we left. And Mr. Schwartz, I'm just making sure that I've got the orders of magnitude correct. I heard you say that the overall cost for the 1% increment in employee compensation was 2.4, and public safety is at 800,000, which is a third of the total, not a quarter. Or is it a 3.2 all-in cost, 2.4 non-public safety, 800 public safety?
It's interesting. I did not get my undergraduate degree in mathematics, as I just proved. So you are correct. It is 1/3, not 1/4.
he's got the pen out. The economist
Okay.
is here.
That is correct. It's 1/3.
Okay.
Is that good? Mr. Dorsey, we're good?
Yeah, just wanted to make sure I had the numbers correct. That's all.
Got it. So we're ready to leave electric vehicles. At least for my part, not only do I support those statements, there's also a discussion of funding for infrastructure, which would be one time, which I think is in the order of 250,000. But we will continue to go around and ask questions. I see some leftover hands or maybe some new hands. And so Ms. Crystal and then Mr. Karantonis.
Thank you. I just wanted to surface a little bit of discussion about a proposal from the Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities Subcommittee of our Community Services Board. They've come to us with an understanding that there might be as much as $4 million in savings from operational dollars from DD and ID day programs, adult day programs, not being operational during the pandemic. My cursory understanding from staff is that it's a little more complicated than that, but that their goal of realizing more facilities, adult program facilities for those with intellectual and developmental disabilities is a priority that we, of course, share on the board and that the county staff has already started some work on. So if staff could just take the opportunity to share a little more about what that picture looks like, both to the extent, there are unspent funds in programming when that might be realized, and then any other work that's underway to better ascertain and plan for the needs for those type of future expansions of facilities.
Okay, I'm going to ask Ms. Cowan to take a shot at that and see if she needs any help from Mr. Stevenson or anybody else. Michelle?
Yeah, and we actually just put out another response on that went in the package that you just saw. So, well, certainly with the pandemic, we know that there have been savings in the DD area that are one time. We need to close out the fiscal year, though, to make sure that we know what those dollars are, how much, and then how that rolls into the broader budget picture. Because as you recall, the balance 21, given our loss, significant loss of revenues, in particular hotel meals and sales, we relied on expenditure savings rather than coming back to the board and saying, let's cut all these programs. We want to make sure we give you that holistic picture before we say right now, and that would be as part of the closeout process as well, how much money we have available in that area. So that's the first thing. But more importantly, to the policy question, DHS had kicked off a procurement process where they ended up not receiving bids to do an assessment of how we could look at meeting the unmet demand in the DD day programs. And that what you will see in this response is they're ready to kick off that comprehensive assessment to look at what the needs are and then what the best solutions might be to meet that need, whether it might be a mix of expanding our existing programs or setting up a whole new program. And I think the color of money, I think as you said, Katie, does matter here. It may not require purchasing a facility or building a new building or an expansion. It might be that we might be able to find some lease space, right? That would be operating dollars. And then along with that is what is the right program setup, what type of staff do you need, how large do we want that type of program? I think it's like all those things together to come back with working with CSB and the DD committee, what are the appropriate, options there, and then what are the best ways to fund? And it could be some capital, there's no doubt about it. It could be, but it could be let's lease out some space somewhere, or it could be those types of things. So I think we're committed to kicking off that work. The Behavioral Health Division, of course, is working on the crisis response efforts related to the PPG work as well. So that's a big effort that they're kicking off right now too. So a lot going on in the mental health area. So trying to make sure we want to do all these things, but we do them well. That's part of it.
Yeah. Thank you. That's a really helpful description. And I think that it sounds like you guys, the writing, the information in writing will also be available too on our budget website. Appreciate that very much.
Great, thank you both. I think we're on the same topic. I think Ms. Garvey's interested. Mr. Karantonis, we'll go to Ms. Garvey, and then you may have the same topic as well, but I know that Ms. Garvey is interested in this topic, if it's okay.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. DeFranti. And I'll be quick. Ms. Crystal, I really appreciate you raising this, and I appreciate the work that staff has done. And Ms. Cowan, I wonder, so the kickoff in September, and I think that I understand the need to do it correctly, and perhaps we'll maybe look at doing some sort of budget guidance just to make clear that this is really a priority for the board possibly. But if you're doing the kickoff in September, do you have a sense of how long it would take? I was kind of looking at the overall schedule.
I don't, but I can get back to you on that, Ms. Garvey,
Okay.
and put something in writing or let the board know. I just don't off the top of my head.
Thank you. Now, I think that would be helpful. I mean, I believe staff are committed to this, and I think we all are, but I think the more we can kind of reassure people that we've sort of got a bit of a definite timeline and schedule that we'll be working on, I think that will be helpful, because it's obviously a real need out there, but we do want to do it correctly, but as quickly as we can, properly. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Garvey. Mr. Karantonis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Quick question. It's about small business needs and small business support as we hopefully enter recovery mode, after these very, very difficult year for everybody. So number one is we heard from the Chamber of Commerce asking for grants to support the recovery of restaurant businesses, etc. Personally, I believe that public money should be invested in loans, in microloans, or in a macroloan program that would target exactly the businesses that need the support right now. So the question number one is, what can be accommodated in the budget? I saw a note from the manager that this is something that the American Rescue Plan money can possibly fund. So I would like to understand what the plan is there. And the second is when significant agent on site, literally on the street, are our urban partnerships. I refer specifically on the League Highway Alliance. I've seen with satisfaction that their funding has been not exactly restored, but it has been converted into ongoing. So this $25,000 that we're missing there. But I wonder whether we could support the League Highway Alliance and the Clarendon Alliance with a sturdy base of base support around $100,000 each, so that they can support us with the work they do in their corridors with the small businesses, with placemaking, with events. They are significant agents to revitalize and get the economic machine humming again, especially in these neighborhoods. So I wanted to know what the position of the manager is and what my colleagues think about that.
Okay, so I will take a shot at that. I'm doing my best to remember each piece. If I miss something, you can bring it back up. On the question about small businesses and financial assistance, grants as opposed to loans, you and I had a conversation about this earlier, and I also had the same conversation with Telly Tucker, who's the Director of Economic Development. I think where I have landed right now is I'm supportive of doing some sort of loan program with one caveat, which I think is important, which you and I have talked about, which is I do not want county staff to be administering
Yes.
this kind of program. There are potential partners out in the community, whether CDFIs or CDCs, or that we will explore with that. And I think that providing that sort of sustenance to the businesses where they have some skin in the game is real important. So that's the first piece. And so there is money available to seed some sort of a loan fund out of the one-time bucket. I think we could do that. I think I probably missed some of your other questions. As far as the alliances, we had provided ongoing funding to try to bring them up to the point of level where they had been, but I don't think that there is actually, in what I sent to you, additional funds. I think you were talking about additional monies beyond
Yes.
that. So I would just repeat again, I think whether it was Ms. Crystal or Mr. Dorsey said, at this point, there's no additional ongoing dollars available for that, but certainly interested to hear what your colleagues have to say and whether there's some kind of guidance that you want to deliver to us to come back with options.
Thank you, Mr. Karantonis and Mr. Schwartz. I'll offer my thoughts, which is the $2 million in the contingency fund. I think there's money there that could be for targeted recovery money, grants. Some portion of that sounds like the manager is open to. This is this complicated policy area better than I do, and so I don't know that of that a large percentage would be my instinct to start, because but I certainly am open to some of that funding. I think an equity mindset with respect to nonprofits, in addition to businesses that have had to lay people off, is important to me. So that's my 2 cents on that. I know you're going to be persistent on this, and I know that this is a big policy change that I understand why you're so supportive of. And then with respect to the partnerships, I guess I'm in Mr. Dorsey's kind of perspective of, let's mitigate the challenge, and we're addressing some of the ongoing debates that we've had on Lee Highway Alliance by putting this in, the manager proposing to put this in ongoing funding. So I'm at a recovery place on that, as opposed to stepping up beyond the 85, and I need to look at Clarendon. But I see Mr. Dorsey's hand.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And since Mr. Karantonis invited feedback, I'll give feedback on that, and it dovetails into my question about Arlington Independent Media. So with this, Mr. Karantonis, I think I understand the spirit of where you are. I associate myself with the chair that any additional appropriation to those entities, unless properly and narrowly constrained, will become a part of the ongoing expectation that we're not yet ready as part of this process to meet. That said, I think there's merit to the whole idea that a partnership should have a viable source if there is a great idea that merits one-time funding, to think that we could be a partner in facilitating it. And perhaps a way to deal with that is to think about some supplement to add to the manager's contingent, so that if something does arise, that we could signal to the partnerships, look, we're ready for your innovative approaches. And if you've got something that meets our liking, we'll at least have confidence that we'll have room to do it, which I think is, probably as far as I'd be willing to offer at this point to them. As it relates to Arlington Independent Media, one of the things that I desire, and this is open for colleagues, staff, whoever has good ideas on this, I really want to figure out what is the baseline level of support that we think is appropriate for AIM. We've had the model before that here's the level of support, we'd like to step it down, and that's been the basis of your proposals in prior years. I endeavor to have a different approach, one that we determine what's the level of support that we think is merited, and that become our ongoing baseline, because maybe I'm just fatigued by having this annual conversation, but I do think, maybe we can do better. So that's kind of what I'm hoping, colleagues, is that we can somehow figure that out sooner rather than later.
Got it. That's a great question, and how to do that has befuddled us for a few years. Ms. Crystal.
Yeah, I'm happy to start by weighing in on that one, and then I'll back my way into the partnerships, since I've spent a lot of time with that as the liaison to AIM, and personally have just felt such encouragement at the efforts, and I see the manager nodding, and I know he's talked recently with the acting leadership there, the efforts the organization have made to put themselves on a path to sustainability. And so it's interesting because the appropriation can be the same or decrease by a certain percent, which it actually still does, even with the one-time money becoming ongoing each year, and it can belie just how much change is happening, and progress towards financial sustainability can be happening. And so I think I had grown certainly weary of having this conversation year after year without any kind of clear path to sustainability. And though our appropriation has not meaningfully changed beyond that modest step down, I think the organization, as we recently saw actually in a report from their auditor, is in just heaps better shape in terms of their keeping current on their licensing, et cetera, as well as having a vision for the future. None of which actually responds directly to your question, so I'm sorry, but I share that only because I think it's important context we might not otherwise have visibility into. It's an interesting question.
Exactly responsive.
Was
right?
it? Okay, good. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I think to some extent this is a little bit of a question of if we were from scratch saying what should government role and the general fund's role and the taxpayers' role be in subsidizing independent media, we may not arrive at this figure, but the sort of historical legacy of them being largely funded through and getting free rent through our cable franchise fee agreements, which is now a source of revenue that's going away, has kind of left us with some of these legacy challenges. Suffice it to say, I'm very excited about the extent to which I think this organization is on a path to greater sustainability with our support. And the other thing I'm excited about is, you know, the greater role they can play as a community hub, because how often, right, from the Northern Virginia Conservation Trust to our arts nonprofits, have we heard some groups say we just need to get our message out, right? And so thinking about the role that AIM as a message amplifier can play in our nonprofit community is an exciting one. Anyway, that's probably enough said by me on that topic. The partnership, I just wanted to co-sign on that idea that you've just offered with regard to the partnerships. I think that is an excellent one, that we could create the expectation that the manager's contingent in collaboration with the board could be a source of tactical money. And that's really what it comes down to. This isn't just hypothetical. We've literally seen this happen in the past, that we use this point of the budget process to try to solve one problem with another, or we know that there is an issue with DES, water, sewer, street support being stepped down on Columbia Pike. And so this is a chance for a one-year partnership, or we're asking of CPRO, or we're asking Lee Highway to play a greater role in Plan Lee Highway. All of these intentions for one-time money get understood understandably by our scrappy grassroots organizations as part of their budget. And then when it goes away the next year, it's catastrophic. And so thinking about just sort of that process piece of, you know, how do we respond tactically, seize opportunities, but really create that expectation. I think the idea of using the manager's contingent, not that it's an bottomless well, but I think could be a great tactical way to go about it.
Thank you, Ms. Crystal. See your hand again, Mr. Dorsey, but I think Mr. Karantonis, I think you may have found a way towards the tactical support that's possible. Did you have other comments on that, or should we?
No, I would have comments about the tactical support, which is all good and fine. I have a different approach to that. That doesn't mean that I'm not supportive of this. It's just a different strategic vision to how we support and how we ask our partnerships to plan long-term and to plan their actions long-term, because they are strategic partners in an environment where we really need to up our game in economic development, especially with small businesses, retail, and everything. In Clarendon and the highway specifically, they change a lot. On AIM, I have to say, not only, I mean, to Ms. Crystal's remark, not only a lot of community organizations needs to get their message out, the government as well. So my question is always what AIM can do for us in addition to what they already are doing, seeing forward towards the future. They have amazing production capacity. They have a lot of volunteer, but also expert skills and talents. So I'm really looking forward to see how best we can make the most out of a organization that now is way more stable and more mobile. So that's really an asset there.
Got it. So that sounds like you're ready to enlist in some of the work that Mr. Dorsey kind of put forward. Mm-hmm. I'm not signing you up, but just suggesting. So sort of being mindful of time and hoping to give us, we have our COVID work session coming up at 6. I wanted to just surface a couple of things that Mr. Stevenson and Ms. Meredith and DMF staff would like, getting everything out there. If you don't know, colleagues, I did have a conversation with Mr. Dorsey where he suggested openness, willingness to work on some language with respect to the future on environmental issues. And there's several organizations recommended a person leading on climate at the manager level, and we wanted to. It doesn't seem like now is the moment to do that, but guidance is what. It doesn't seem like now is the moment to enforce that and say it has to happen yesterday. But I do think we want to signal that that's a direction that we would like to go in. I see your hand, Mr. Karantonis, and certainly Mr. Dorsey. I may not have framed it just right. I think there is a shared commitment to the existential threat that climate change shows, and an urgency to that. So, Mr. Karantonis.
And I think there is a lot of synergies between departments, between different actions of departments that could be. For the first time this year, we had a position that really coordinates and makes an issue a whole government issue, and that was equity, right? That was the Samia Bird. And I believe that this is a very good precedence for what is meant and intended here, only in a different whole government issue, which is climate change response and being responsive as a government in all our actions, in all our interventions. So I agree that guidance is due right now, and I look forward to participate in this conversation.
Thank you, Mr. Karantonis. Mr. Dorsey.
Sure, and just to sort of preview what Mr. DeFerranti and I discussed with some advocates and what is likely to be the direction of what we propose in text, it is to give the manager some time to think about how to bring this whole of government approach to climate and sustainability short of our allotting an ongoing permanent position as a climate czar or to staff a climate office in this fiscal year. So, and look, I don't blame any advocate. The thought is always to bring a need to the surface in the form of a budget allocation. However, when you're talking about building an office, you're talking about onboarding staff, chiefly that person is going to be working at the direction and being responsive to the manager. And I would much prefer that the manager take a central role in deciding how that's going to fit within the overall structure of the government and to think about different models for meeting the policy objective. So the guidance is intended to outline the policy objective, give the manager some time to give us some models of what he thinks is appropriate, and then we'll determine at some future point whether or not that meets with a budget allocation and how much and in what form. I'll remind everybody that the process that we went through with the race and equity officer in many ways is consistent with this. We outlined the need and the desire, and then the manager determined after some thought how he could best meet it. And when the time came for him to implement it, he found a way to do it off cycle. And so, if he takes his time and comes up with something and feels like there's a mid-year implementation, he's got the room to do it. And certainly that will put us in place for subsequent budgets. So anyway, a long way of saying, I think we can be responsive to this concern fully without necessarily doing what we have been specifically asked to do, and that is to fund a climate czar.
Thank you, Mr. Dorsey. Ms. Garvey.
I think to keep it short, I'll just second everything that Mr. Dorsey said. I think the important, our role is to set the goal, and I think our goals are all the same with our advocates here. It's the manager's job to figure out the best way to meet that goal, and obviously in consultation with us. So I'm very comfortable with we're really clear about the goal, and then figure out the best way to do it. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Ms. Garvey. So we're almost at last call for questions. I will share with colleagues that on the ongoing issue, I have talked with staff, and the ongoing question of making sure that we have all the resources and are doing everything we can to address our caps with respect to upkeep and maintenance for our residents. I'm working on some guidance that will seek to strike that balance of guidance that can be helpful, that's related to contingent consulting funding on housing inspections. So working on that. I will say that AHIF is a subject that we have not talked about, but I know that the manager's memo has a significant increase in AHIF. I know that there is a desire to move that forward. I also know that housing grants is one way that we are seeking to help those below 30% of area median income, and that's an effort that we're focusing on. Ms. Crystal.
I'm so sorry to prolong this since we're already over time, but I wanted to make sure I understood something because as I kind of work on my machinations, this is a big thing I'm trying to solve for. My understanding was that the manager's recommendations do not include any increases to AHIF above what was initially proposed. I'd be delighted to be wrong on that. Am I wrong on that?
You are blissfully and rarely wrong on that one, in the sense that I think there's 7 million above the 8.9 that was in the original proposal. So
terrific.
So
okay.
The policy question that is left outstanding, I believe, is we have heard from advocates regarding another 1.8 or 1.9 million above that is the request. And I know that that's one. One-time funding is a different thing than ongoing funding. But that's the answer on your question, Ms. Crystal.
Great. Okay. So I see, for example,
it's very important for me to say, since I have 5 bosses, that you were both right, because when I put my memo together and made it public, I said I did not speak specifically to the additional funding for AHIF, but so you are right, Ms. Crystal. Mr. DeFerranti is right also, because I have said that given the one-time dollars that we had submitted to you a draft response that showed, I think it's even a little bit more than 7 million, so that the number matched what it was we had proposed in the fiscal 21 budget, with my normal and at this point boring caveats that we make sure that we talk a little bit about how we need to do an assessment of the affordable housing stock, and also the issues that Mr. DeFerranti brought up about making sure that we have the appropriate inspection resources.
Thank you. And we, I think adopted fiscal 21 was 16 million. So you said it matches the fiscal 21 proposed.
I'm gonna let Ms. Hughes tell me what the number is, because I'm drawing a blank.
The one-time funding matches the one-time funding that was in the fiscal 21 proposed. That brings it up to 16 million.
16 million. Okay, great. Yeah. I have never been so happy to be wrong. Thank you. I really appreciate the clarification.
So we have one time, and then there's also request on the ongoing, which the manager worked before this budget to increase the percentage of AHIF that was fully funded by ongoing. There's a small dollar request there. We have more to do to finalize. I don't know that I have other big areas to raise to make sure that we're not surprising Mr. Stevenson and Ms. Meredith and Ms. Hughes. But I will say one topic we haven't discussed that I think at least bears a word is the schools. Their request was one-time funding. And I guess all I would want to just share with colleagues is following up on yesterday's work session, I did talk with Mr. Dorsey a little bit about, I do think that there's some work after this budget is done on just work with school board colleagues, perhaps in 2x2s or conversations to try and address, to work on some of the issues that we'll face going forward with what appears to be some structural challenges in funding there, as much as we all care about and want to fund schools. So I would say that that's relevant to my perspective and an interest in the one-time funding, but there's lots there that each of us would have thoughts on. I think that is all that I have, and we're later, but then we wanted to get the break before 6, but we do have time for a break. Any closing thoughts, comments from colleagues?
Very helpful. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, thank you each for all you're doing on the budget, and we will, there'll be much work to do before Thursday. And with that, we will adjourn this budget work session, and we will see you at 6 o'clock for our COVID discussion, which of course will be a lot of interest to the community and an important discussion. Thank you, colleagues.
Thank you. Thanks to staff too. Thanks, everybody.
Yes.
See you soon.